He signed the papers the way he did most things. Quietly, without ceremony, without giving them the satisfaction of watching him flinch. The conference room smelled of recycled air and expensive cologne that didn't belong to Owen Mercer. He set the pen down, pushed the folder across the table, and stood.
Yes.
Across from him, his wife's attorney was already gathering the pages with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times, and found it neither interesting nor sad. Victoria sat beside him, one hand resting on the table, relaxed. He watched Owen. The way you watch a door close on a room you've already decided you're done with. You would keep the house in Scottsdale, the investment accounts, the car that still had his gym bag in the trunk. Her attorney had structured it cleanly, efficiently. Owen had no full-time employment contract, no fixed income a court could attach a number to, no property registered in his name. On paper, he was a man who had spent the last 4 years living off his wife's salary, while dabbling in something no one had asked about. Settlement offered him 2 weekends a month with his daughter and a cash sum that was generous. In the way that a closed door is generous, it asks nothing of you, because it expects nothing from you. Picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, nodded once at no one in particular, and walked out. No one in that room believed they had just watched a man leave with anything that mattered. The story didn't begin in that conference room. It began 3 years earlier in the back bedroom of a rental house in Tempe, Arizona, where Owen kept a desk that faced a wall because facing a window he'd found gave him too many reasons to stop working. He was 39. His daughter Sophie was 4, then 5, then 6, in the way that children age when you're not paying attention to the calendar. Sophie had his same habit of going quiet when something was bothering her, sitting with it until she'd worked it all the virtue. Owen had always considered this a virtue. Victoria had always considered it a problem. Drove Sophie to school every morning. He picked her up. He knew which lunch she'd actually eat versus which one she'd trade away and which one she'd bring home entirely untouched and claim to have finished. He knew the name of every kid in her class, the ones she liked, the ones she didn't, and why. He had built his entire life around the small, unglamorous architecture of keeping a 6-year-old's world stable and predictable. In the hours after she was asleep and the house had gone still, he had been building something else entirely. They sit it down. Owen had a background in data infrastructure. He'd spent his 20s working for 2 different firms, saved carefully, and then left when Sophie arrived. Because the math of childcare never worked in a way he could make himself accept. He wasn't wired to hand his daughter to a stranger at 7 in the morning and pick her up at 6 at night and call that raising her. So he didn't. What he did instead, in the hours between midnight and 3, was build a logistic optimization platform for small freight carriers. It was technical and unglamorous and addressed a problem most people in his industry considered solved, which is precisely why it wasn't. He had identified a gap in the way regional carriers handled last-minute route adjustments. The existing tools were either too expensive or too slow, and the companies that needed them most were the ones least able to afford the enterprise options. Owen's platform sat in between. Lean, fast, priced for the middle market. He funded it entirely from an account his late mother had left him. He had kept that account separate from the day he opened it. Not out of suspicion, but out of a habit of precision that ran through everything he did. He registered the intellectual property in his own name, filed the paperwork himself, and went back to work. He told Victoria he was doing freelance consulting. She didn't ask follow-up questions. There was a period early in the marriage when she might have. But that period had ended somewhere around the time her own career had begun to accelerate. Victoria was a regional director for a medical device company. She was good at it, in a way that was visible. You could watch her walk into a room and understand immediately that she was the most prepared person there. She had married Owen when they were both young and starting out. And somewhere along the way, she had developed a theory about the kind of man she had ended up with. The theory was not unkind, exactly. It was just that it had stopped accounting for the desk in the back bedroom and the hours he kept there. She filed on a Thursday in March. Owen was at the kitchen counter when she came home, and she set her bag down and told him with the particular evenness of someone who had decided not to have feelings about something anymore. She had already retained counsel. There was no point in drawing it out. They simply wanted different things. Dick stood there. Owen stood there with a mug in his hand and understood several things at once. He understood that the decision was not new. The word divorce was just the last piece of paperwork in a process that had been underway for longer than either of them had said out loud. He also understood. 2 days later, when he read the proposal her attorney had sent over, what the actual shape of the fight was going to be. Victoria was seeking primary custody of Sophie. She was seeking the house, the shared accounts, and a child support arrangement predicated on Owen's documented income, which on paper was close to nothing. The argument was framed gently. As Sandra Oakes would later tell him, these arguments always were. Not that he was a bad father, but that he was a financially dependent one. A man without stable employment. Set it down. A man whose contributions to the household were, the document implied, the kind that didn't translate into a stable independent home for a child. He read it twice. Sophie was on the floor beside the coffee table, drawing something with a level of concentration she usually reserved for things that mattered to her. Owen watched his daughter draw and felt something in his chest go very cold and very clear. On paper, they had him exactly right. That was the part that was hardest to sit with. He had done the invisible work for 4 years, and invisible work, by definition, left nothing a family court judge could read. For a few days he considered the path that was right there in front of him. The one that was reasonable and quiet, and cost nothing but surrender. He could sign, he could absorb it, he could accept the 2 weekends a month and avoid a war. He couldn't obviously win. There was a version of that choice that looked almost like dignity. The thing that closed that door came on a Sunday night. Owen had finished the bedtime routine. Bath, pajamas, the specific stuffed animal that had to be located before anything else could proceed. 2 chapters of a book about a rabbit who kept making very reasonable decisions that turned out badly. He had turned off the light and was standing to go when Sophie reached up from under the blanket and put her hand around his wrist. The way small children grab on without realizing they're grabbing on. "Dad," she said, "when I'm at Mom's house, do you still think about me?" It wasn't a loaded question. She was 6. She asked it with the same mild curiosity she brought to everything. whether the sun went away at night or just hid, whether dogs understood English or just pretended. Owen sat back down on the edge of the bed. Every single day, he said. Every hour. Second. She considered this, apparently satisfied, and released his wrist and turned on her side. He sat in the dark for a long time after her breathing had gone slow and even. Somewhere in the house, a settlement was waiting on the kitchen counter. Someone he had never met had drawn a schedule. 2 weekends a month, and decided that was an adequate amount of fatherhood for a man like him. That it set it down. Owen thought about every hour of every day for the next 12 years, and understood that he was not going to sign a single line of it. He called a family attorney the next morning, after the school drop-off. He'd spent 3 days asking around, and one name kept surfacing, a woman named Ruth Halsey, who practiced out of a building downtown, and whom people described in a consistent way. Not warm, but precise, the kind of attorney who went into a courtroom knowing exactly how much of the floor she owned. She answered her own line. Halsey. He set it down. "My name is Owen Mercer," he said. "My wife wants to take my daughter, and she's assuming I can't afford to stop her." A brief silence. Not hesitation, he understood later, but assessment. "That's a specific way to frame it," Halsey said. "Most people lead with the house. The house doesn't matter." Another pause. Something shifted by a single degree in her voice. "Come in Thursday at 8. Bring anything financial that's in your name alone. And don't sign anything between now and then." They made Sophie's favorite dinner that night. Pasta with butter. And too much Parmesan, which she considered a completely normal amount. She considered a completely normal amount, and listened to a long explanation of a game that appeared to have different rules depending on who was currently winning. He did the dishes. He found the stuffed animal and put it in its place. And only when the house had gone quiet did he walk to the back bedroom, sit down at the desk that faced the wall, and turn on the monitor. The platform was where he'd left it. 2.5 years of midnights, patient and unannounced, the work no one had thought to ask about. He sat in front of it for a long time, without typing anything. He didn't know yet how large the thing he had built actually was. He didn't know that 3 weeks earlier, an engineer at a transportation investment group in Denver, had stumbled across his repository and flagged it internally as the cleanest architecture he'd seen in the space in years. They set it down. He didn't know that a conversation had already begun in a conference about a project he'd never told anyone existed. Anyone, Sever Sears, Sever Sign. He only knew he had a daughter who wondered if he thought about her when she was gone, and that he had told her he did, every hour, and that this was the kind of thing he did not say, unless he meant it. Ruth Halsey's office was on the 7th floor, and she read the settlement proposal without expression. Start to finish, before she said a single word. Then she set it down. "On paper," she said, "you have almost nothing." Set it down. Owen had braced for something gentler. He was relieved not to get it. No employment contract, no documented income, no property in your name. Her team isn't going to call you an unfit father. That's too blunt, and they're not amateurs. They're going to call you a dependent father. A man who has been supported by his wife's income for 4 years, and whose contributions, while genuine, are unmeasurable by the standards a family court applies. She looked at him over the file. They'll be sympathetic about it. That's what makes it effective. I've been building something, Owen said. A software platform, 3 years of it. She waited. He told her everything. The account from his mother kept separate since the day he'd received it. The servers and licenses purchased only from that account. The IP registration filed in his name alone. The hours, after midnight, after the house had exhaled, in a room that held nothing but a desk and a machine that hummed in the corner. This is serious. Halls listened without writing anything down. That's better than you realize, she said when he finished. But I want you to understand the ground we're standing on. Arizona is a community property state. The default assumption is that anything created during a marriage belongs equally to both spouses. What you've described isn't a defense yet. It's the raw material for one. Separate inheritance, separate account, separate registration, separate hours. I can build a wall out of those bricks, but I need every receipt, every timestamp, every record that documents the separation. She fixed him with a level stare. We are going to prove the unprovable, Mr. Mercer. And we are going to do it entirely on paper, because a courtroom has no room for anything else. Before he left, she gave him one instruction he hadn't expected. Agree to the divorce, she said. Sign the dissolution, and nothing else. Don't contest the marriage ending. A man who fights to stay married to a woman who's leaving looks desperate, and desperate doesn't help you. But the accounts, the house, the custody arrangement, you concede nothing. You sign one page, you walk out, and you let them believe whatever they've decided to believe. He looked at him without sentiment. The most useful thing you can do right now is let them underestimate you. In the glass conference room of Victoria's attorney. 2 weeks later, that was exactly what Owen did. He signed the consent to dissolve the marriage, picked up his jacket, and carried Sophie, asleep. After a long afternoon of waiting, out through the lobby and into the April afternoon, he let the door close behind him and let everyone in that room believe the harder Connor conversations. Connor conversation was already over. He had signed away nothing that mattered. The months that followed taught him what pressure looked like when it was applied without anger. Victoria's team never raised its voice. It didn't have to. A request came through for a psychological evaluation of Owen. Routine, they said, standard process in cases involving primary custody. The implication didn't need to be spelled out. The question was planted and left to grow. Was he stable enough to parent alone? Ask it. Could a man whose life looked this irregular on paper be trusted with a child full-time? The visitation schedule frayed. A Friday pickup was pushed to Saturday. A full weekend was canceled because Sophie had a cold, though when Owen called, he sounded fine, and asked 3 times when she was going to see him. The cancellations were each individually reasonable. Together they were a pattern, and Owen recognized the pattern for what it was. A lesson delivered one missed weekend at a time, in how expensive it was going to be to keep fighting. He didn't stop fighting. He also didn't sleep much. The thing that changed the shape of everything arrived on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon in Halsey's office, delivered in a single careful sentence. Mr. Mercer, she said, not looking up from her screen, are you aware that someone has made an offer to acquire your platform? This Owen went still. Never approached anyone. I know. She turned the monitor toward him. A logistics investment group out of Denver. The offer is preliminary. Nothing signed, nothing public. But the figure they've floated is 7 figures. Comfortably. She let that sit. I put the core architecture up as an open repository, Owen said slowly, under my own name, just to test it against real scrutiny. I never marketed it. I never told anyone it existed. Someone found it anyway. Halsey pulled up a second document, then a third. Here's what I want you to think carefully about. Victoria filed in March. I have the timestamps on the earliest correspondence between her attorney and her company's internal legal team, and I now have something else. A thread of communication between a man named Garrett Finch, who, I understand, was introduced to you once as a colleague of your wife's, and a contact at the same investment group that produced this offer.
Biskamov.
Owen looked at her. You're saying she knew. I'm saying the timeline isn't accidental. Halsey's voice didn't rise. It sharpened, which was different. She didn't file slowly and then get surprised by your good fortune. She moved quickly. More quickly than the end of a quiet marriage typically requires. If this acquisition becomes public before the dissolution is finalized, the platform is an asset on the table, and she'd have to fight for it, nest in the open, with a judge watching. Far cleaner to finalize while you're still a man with no documented income, before anyone has to acknowledge what you were actually holding. Owen sat with this for a long moment. That for weeks he had been telling himself a particular version of the story, that he was the man who had done the invisible work and been discarded because invisible work left no record. He had felt sorry for himself in the private hours, and then felt ashamed of it. But that wasn't the story. That had never been the story. Victoria had not left because she'd decided he was going nowhere. She'd left because she had understood, through some channel he hadn't tracked, that he was about to arrive, and she had wanted to be on the other side of the paperwork before that happened. He had not been a husband being discarded. He had been an asset being quietly liquidated by someone who knew its value better than he had. Something cold replaced the self-pity. Something clear and very still. Okay, he said. Okay, Halsey agreed. Victoria escalated. When she realized he wasn't going to settle, it came sideways. He sat down, the way the effective pressure always did. Through Garrett Finch and the comfortable social gravity of people who knew people in the right rooms, a fog of doubt began to circulate around the acquisition. Not accusations. Nothing traceable. Nothing he could point to in a court filing. Just questions seeded carefully in the right conversations. Was the IP ownership clean? Was the founder in the middle of a messy family dispute? Bet it down. Had there been any commingling of marital assets in the development? A fund would be wise to wait for the dust to settle. He set it down. Then one evening she came to him in person. Jason, Owen, had taken a 2-bedroom apartment near Sophie's school. Low ceilings, thin walls, a parking lot view. And he was at the table, working through financial records for Halsey when the knock came. Sophie was already asleep in the other room. Victoria stood in the doorway, in a coat he didn't recognize, which meant it was new, which meant she had kept buying things that announced she was doing well. He stepped back to let her in, because Sophie was sleeping, and he wouldn't have this conversation in the hall. She looked around the apartment without saying anything. The look was not contemptuous. It was worse than contempt. It was the faintly uncomfortable pity of someone who has decided they are the reasonable party in a situation and finds the evidence inconvenient. Then she made her offer, and she made it well, because making offers in rooms was something she was genuinely skilled at. He would accept a revised settlement, more cash than the original, a structured payment over 3 years. She would remove her quiet pressure on the acquisition. Sophie's schedule would be formalized generously. No drawn-out courtroom process, no more uncertainty for anyone. Everyone would walk away with something. "Dan, you're a better father than you are a businessman, Owen," she said, and her voice carried something that almost sounded like affection. "I mean that. Don't walk into a room you were never meant to stand in." Owen looked at her across the small apartment. He thought about the desk in the back bedroom. He thought about a 6-year-old's hand around his wrist in the dark. "You should go," he said. He recalibrated. He could see it happen, a small adjustment behind her eyes. And then she went. Her footsteps were precise on the concrete walkway outside, and then the parking lot was quiet again. He sat alone at the table for a long time after that, because the doubt was real, even if he didn't let her see it. It was one thing to refuse to lose. It was another to drag a 6-year-old through a process this slow and grinding. The evaluations, the canceled weekends, the telephone calls, where Sophie asked questions he didn't have full answers for. In the other room, his daughter was asleep, with one arm hanging off the edge of the mattress. He wondered whether a child needed a father who won or a father who was simply reliably present, and whether he had any right to gamble one against the other. He didn't have an answer by morning. He only had the work, and the thing he'd said in the dark every single day, every hour. So he kept going. The floor dropped out 10 days before the hearing. The financial news site ran a brief item, the kind that circulates before anyone has verified it, characterizing his platform as carrying unresolved IP complications connected to an active divorce proceeding. It was framed as cautious reporting and constructed to read like risk. By the afternoon, the Denver group's representatives had requested a pause negotiation pending legal review. The same morning, Victoria's attorneys filed a petition with the court to freeze all assets connected to the platform for the duration of the custody proceedings. Halsey called him at noon and didn't begin with reassurance. "If the court grants the freeze," she said, "the acquisition stalls indefinitely. You lose the only thing that actually changes the conversation. We'd be back to where they designed this to leave you, a man with no provable assets, fighting on their terms." Eddie set it down. Owen was standing at the apartment window, looking at the parking lot. "I won't tell you it's over," Halsey said, "but I'll tell you it's close." He stood there after the call, phone still in his hand. His asset was frozen in Vrigan, but name. The acquisition was going cold in real time. His daughter's custody was no more certain than it had been the afternoon. Victoria had set her bag on the counter and told him the marriage was ending. He was, when he stripped it all the way down, exactly what that first proposal had described. A man with no provable income, no fixed address of significance, fighting to keep his daughter. But Halsey hadn't finished. "There's one more thing," she'd said before hanging up, her voice shifting by the same small degree he'd learned to pay attention to. "I've spent the last week tracing the source of that news item. The specific language in it, The framing about the divorce, the IP characterization. That's not a journalist who went digging. That phrasing existed in exactly 2 places, with your wife and with Garrett Finch. Someone handed that story to a contact and handed that story to a contact and timed the placement deliberately, and there were only so many hands it could have passed through. Then we find the hand, Owen had said. We find the hand, Halsey agreed. The morning of the hearing was clear and dry, the kind of Phoenix spring day that arrives without apology. Owen was awake before 5. He had laid out the one good suit the night before. Driven Sophie to his neighbor Carol's house, with a promise to be back before dinner. Crouched to straighten the girl's collar, set it down, and held on for a moment longer than necessary before he let go. Then he stood at the curb in front of the apartment and waited, because Halsey had told him only that someone would come, and that he should let them. The car that came was a black Porsche Panamera, moving quietly through the early morning. The man who drove it was named Conrad Voss, and Owen knew the name, the way you know the names of peoples who exist several layers above the conversations you're usually part of. Voss was the managing partner of the Denver group. He was the quiet money at the center of everything, and Owen had assumed reasonably that men like him didn't appear in person for situations this granular. Voss leaned across and pushed the passenger door open. Get in. You want to be early. Early gives them time to see you walking around like you belong there. Bet it Owen got in. For several blocks, Voss said nothing. The city was just beginning to show light at the edges. One of my analysts kept pulling up the same repository, Voss said eventually. Yours. Sent me a note saying the architecture solved a problem we'd been watching for 3 years, and that whoever built it, Tveston, tried to sell it. Hadn't tried to sell it to anyone, hadn't put a deck together, hadn't done any of the things people do when they want to be noticed. He glanced over. Nobody sends me something they're not trying to sell. You didn't send me anything. Oh. That's the only reason I went looking. 2 blocks from the courthouse. Voss pulled to the curb. You drive it in, he said, and he got out and walked around to the passenger side before Owen could respond. A man ought to arrive at his own fight under his own hands. Something moved in his expression, something dry and not unkind. And it won't hurt for the right people to see who's in the passenger seat. Owen understood the geometry of the gift, and the cold strategy folded inside it. Then he put the car in drive. The courthouse steps were busy when the Panamera turned the corner and rolled to a stop that he set it down. There were 2 reporters near the base of the steps. The acquisition had leaked into the financial press, and a 7-figure deal tied up in a family court proceeding was the kind of story that filed itself. Victoria's lead attorney was already on the steps, file folder under one arm, moving with the purposeful efficiency of someone who had structured this morning to go a particular way. But Garrett Finch was near the entrance, hands in his pockets, watching the street with the comfortable expression of a man who has come to observe an outcome he considers already arranged. The door opened and Owen Mercer stepped out. For a moment, the steps rearranged themselves around him. The man everyone in that first conference room had understood to be finished. The one who had walked out with a duffel bag and nothing on paper, stood in the morning light in a single, unhurried motion, alone, without performance. Conrad Voss emerged from the passenger side a beat later and buttoned his jacket without looking up. That was the detail that landed, because the reporters who recognized the name began to say it, and the name carried. And Owen watched the calculation move across Garrett Finch's face. The sudden, queasy arithmetic of a man realizing the board he thought he understood had been reset without his knowledge. Finch looked at Voss, then at Owen, and then he looked at nothing in particular, and turned and walked toward the parking structure, without making eye contact with anyone. He did not come back. Inside, the hearing proceeded, with the patience that courtrooms require and that interested parties rarely feel. Victoria's team was good. They were composed and they were precise. And the picture they painted was the one they had been building for months, a devoted but economically unstable home. A father with no verifiable income, a mother positioned to offer the child structure and continuity, and a name that opened doors. They did not say he was a bad father. They said, with considerable warmth, that the evidence did not support him as an independent one. Then Halsey opened her file. Desk down, she did not raise her voice once in the next 40 minutes. She began with the timestamps. Victoria's filing date, set against the dates of the earliest communications between her attorney and her company's in-house legal department, set against the date. He set the Denver Group's interest in the platform had first appeared. Internally, the timelines lay side by side on the record, the way a photograph lies next to the thing it depicts. Victoria had not been surprised by the acquisition and reacted. She had seen it coming and moved to finalize before it could surface. The divorce was not the end of a marriage. It was a legal maneuver executed before an asset could be recognized as one. The petitioner did not discover this project late. Halsey told the court, in the tone of someone reading a list of known facts. She discovered it early, and she structured every element of the timing of this proceeding to ensure the dissolution was complete before this asset became visible and required division. The objection came. The judge allowed Halsey to continue. He laid out the news item next. The path her team had reconstructed over the course of a week. The specific phrasing, the IP language that mirrored documentation existing in exactly 2 places. The connection to Garrett Finch, to a contact, set it down to a reporter who had received something and published it at the precise moment it would do maximum damage to the acquisition, and by extension to Owen's only real leverage. He walked it, step by step, without inflection, until it was simply a sequence of events with a clear origin. The disruption of those negotiations, she said, was not market caution. It was manufactured, and the manufacturing involved coordination with a party acting on behalf of the petitioner. A change moved through the room, slow and then not slow. Victoria's attorneys began the quiet, uncomfortable process of disagreeing with one another. The specific whispered tension of a team discovering that part of its foundation was built on something that had not been vetted properly. Then Halsey turned to the asset itself and laid down the bricks, one at a time, until they were a wall. The inheritance from Owen's mother, received before the marriage, and never folded into the shared accounts, the separate account that bore only his name, the servers and licenses purchased from that account and no other, the IP registration filed solely in his name. The work performed between midnight and 3 in the morning in a room that belonged to no shared hour of the marriage, funded by money that had never been community property, in a state that began from the presumption that everything created within a marriage belonged to both parties. Halsey acknowledged the default plainly and then dismantled it, document by document, until the presumption could not stand against the record she had assembled. This was not created with marital resources, she finished. It was not created during marital time. It was not created with marital knowledge, by every standard. This court applies. It is separate property. The attempt to freeze it is an attempt to capture something that was never subject to division. The room was quiet when she sat. The judge looked at Owen for a long moment. He set the filings to one side and looked at him the way judges do when they have heard enough law and want to hear something else. "Mr. Mercer," he said, setting aside the financial picture entirely, "tell me, in your own words, why you're asking for primary custody." Owen stood. He did not reach for the platform, or the timeline, or the acquisition that had just been ruled his. None of it had ever been the point. Standing in the quiet of that room, he found he only had one true thing to say. "A few months ago, I was putting my daughter to bed," he said. His voice was steady and low. "She grabbed my wrist in the dark and asked me if I still thought about her when she was at her mom's house." He stopped for a moment. "She's 6. She wasn't asking anything complicated, but I've thought about it every single day since. Everything I've done in the last several months, I've done because I don't ever want the answer to that question to be, no, I'm not asking for primary custody because of anything I built, Your Honor. I'm asking because I'm the one who's been there, and I don't want her to wonder." He said. Nobody moved. That's saying. The judge looked at him for a moment longer, made a note, and the silence held until he spoke again. The rulings came in order, and they came clean. The petition to freeze the platform assets was denied. The acquisition, the court found no cause to obstruct, would proceed. Primary custody was awarded to Owen, with a defined and regular visitation schedule for Victoria, and on the core question, the court held that the platform was Owen's separate property, developed with separate funds in separate hours, registered in his name alone, and that Victoria's standard share of the genuine marital estate was all she was entitled to. Not a dollar more. Owen watched his ex-wife receive this without expression. She had counted every card and read the hand wrong, and the only evidence of it was a stillness in her face that had not been there in the original conference room 4 months earlier. Outside on the courthouse steps, Voss was waiting with his hands in his pockets. "You want to know why I drove across town this morning?" Voss said. It wasn't really a question. "I'd already decided on the platform. I decided on that weeks ago." He offered his hand that day. "I came because I wanted to see how you carry something like this. People show you everything when the weight is real." He held the handshake a beat longer than necessary. "You held it. We'll close the paperwork by end of month." The acquisition finalized. 3 weeks later. Owen did not mark the occasion. He didn't post anything, didn't call anyone to report what the platform had become. What he did was find a small house in a quiet neighborhood near Sophie's school. Single story, a porch that needed work, a backyard that would take 2 seasons to get right. It was his, and it was hers, and that was the whole measure of what it needed to be. The first night, he did What he always did. He made dinner. He helped Sophie with a worksheet at the kitchen table. He found the stuffed animal and put it in its place. And when she was asleep and the house had gone some quiet and settled the way houses do when they've been lived in for more than a day, he took a cup of coffee out to the porch and sat in the dark and let him feel, briefly, the simple weight of what it meant to have kept his word. He saw Victoria at Sophie's school concert about 6 weeks later. Folding chairs, a low stage, the specific cheerful chaos of second graders performing for their parents. She looked composed, as she always did, though there was something around her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not defeat, exactly, but the particular tiredness of someone who has recalculated and not liked the result he had heard. The quiet way things travel, that whatever had existed between her and Garrett Finch had not survived what had been exposed in that courtroom. He didn't take pleasure in that. It surprised him. It surprised him a little, how cleanly the desire for it had gone. They spoke for a few minutes near the back wall. Sophie's schedule, an upcoming field trip, the practical vocabulary of two people who share a child and very little else. When the concert ended and parents began collecting their kids, Victoria turned to go and then paused. "I didn't know how far along it was, she said, quietly, as though she was saying it to herself as much as to him. "The platform. I knew you were working on something. I didn't know." Owen looked at her for a moment. There were things he could have said, and 4 months earlier he might have wanted to say them. "I know," he said. He nodded once and left. "Dackers," he set it down. He crossed the gymnasium to where Sophie was waiting, holding a paper snowflake she'd made from a kit, already half unraveled at one corner. He crouched down and held the loose part in place while she inspected it, deciding whether it was still acceptable. She decided it was. She took his hand, and they walked out together into the mild evening, and it was not a triumphant moment. And it was not a terrible one. It was just the ordinary texture of a life he had refused to give, moving forward to give away, moving forward the way lives do. One ordinary evening at a time, hand in hand with the only thing that had ever actually mattered. I keep thinking about that moment when Owen sat in the dark after Sophie let go of his wrist. He didn't have a plan yet. He didn't have a lawyer or a strategy or any certainty that things would turn out the way they did. He just had a question. He just had a question his 6-year-old had asked him, and he couldn't find a way to make the answer no. That's the part that stays with me, because here's what I've come to understand about how things actually unfold in life, not in the dramatic, cinematic way, but in the slow, grinding, ordinary way. The outcomes we end up with are almost never random. They grow from the choices we make in the hours when no one is watching. That Owen built something real for 3 years in a back bedroom while the world around him formed a very confident opinion about the kind of man he was. He didn't argue with that opinion. He just kept working. That kind of integrity, doing the right thing quietly, for the right reason without an audience, has a way of compounding. You don't always see it accumulating, but it does. Victoria was smart. She read the situation correctly in almost every way. She understood what Owen had built before he even knew how to value it, and she moved fast to get out ahead of it. But the one thing she miscalculated was character. She thought Owen would weigh the cost of fighting and decide it was too high. He thought a man who had absorbed so much quietly would absorb this too. What she didn't account for was that some things aren't weighed. She set it down. A father sitting on the edge of his daughter's bed at night isn't running numbers. He's making a decision that doesn't have a price. That's what I think of when I think about the word resilience, not the motivational poster version of it, but the real thing. The kind that isn't loud, the kind that just keeps showing up the next morning and doing the next necessary thing. Not because it feels heroic, but because the alternative is something you can't live with. Owen didn't fight because he was brave in some grand sense. He fought because he was precise about what mattered, and everything else was noise. And the intelligence it took. Not cleverness, but the kind of long, patient, careful thinking that kept his finances separate from the first day, that registered the IP in his own name, that built something real without ever telling anyone it existed. That kind of mind doesn't announce itself. It just builds walls out of bricks until the day comes. When someone tries to knock them over and finds out they can't. What I take from Owen's story isn't a lesson about divorce law or software acquisitions or any of the specifics. It's something simpler and harder, the life you're quietly building. Right now, the thing you're doing in the hours when no one asks about it. The promises you make in the dark to people who are counting on you. Those things are not invisible. They're just not visible yet. The record exists. It's being written every day. Sophie asked if he still thought about her when she wasn't there. He told her every hour. Then he went and made sure it was true.